What if I told you one woman decided who was in and who was out in New York's richest circles? Caroline Astor wasn't just a hostess, she was the gatekeeper of America's Gilded Age. From lavish balls to brutal rivalries, she built a kingdom without a crown. But how long can anyone really rule high society? Born into old money. Caroline Schermerhorn was born in 1830 in New York City. She came into the world as a member of the Schermerhorn family, one of the most established Dutch-American names in the city. The family could trace its ancestry back to the days of New Amsterdam, and that history gave their name recognition wherever they went. Being part of this heritage carried privileges that money alone could not buy. Caroline's early years were surrounded by reminders of that family identity. The Schermerhorns held property, belonged to the most respected congregations, and appeared regularly in the records of New York's civic and social life. Their homes were in neighborhoods that were occupied only by families of equal standing. Invitations and appearances were carefully managed, and every action carried meaning within their circle. To be born into this family was to enter a world where names created opportunities and respect was guaranteed by tradition. Her upbringing reflected the expectations of this background. Education in her household meant more than academic lessons. She learned French, music, literature, and the skills considered proper for a young woman of her class. Attention to detail shaped her daily life, from the way she spoke to the way she moved in public. Manners and presentation were treated as essentials, not extras. By the time she was old enough to attend gatherings, she already carried herself with the assurance of someone raised to represent her family. New York during the 1830s and 1840s was growing quickly. Ships brought new arrivals, businesses expanded, and wealth accumulated in new hands. Families like the Schermerhorns stayed within a smaller world. Their gatherings included only names they recognized, and their children were raised among the same families generation after generation. This created a stable environment where the same traditions were passed down. Caroline grew up knowing who belonged in her circle and who did not, and she understood these boundaries as natural parts of life. Her childhood also came with strict rules. Women of her rank were expected to marry carefully, appear respectably, and avoid scandal. A single mistake could affect how the family was viewed. Caroline grew up under constant reminders that her behavior reflected on the Schermerhorn name. She learned early how much weight could rest on a single choice. The idea of such responsibility for family reputation was not just spoken about, but enforced in everyday life. So the Schermerhorn home reflected this way of life. They hosted dinners and events, but only for a select group. Guests were chosen with care, and the choice of who attended or who stayed away carried unspoken meaning. These decisions taught children like Caroline the unwritten rules of society. Her awareness also extended to appearances and surroundings. In her home, nothing was chosen without purpose. Portraits, furniture, and clothing served as signals of refinement. A dress was not only fabric but a message of taste and discipline. The design of a parlor spoke about the family that owned it. Caroline absorbed these details and carried them into her own adulthood. She learned that elegance meant restraint, and that discipline gave weight to every gesture. Dutch identity also played a central role in her upbringing. Old Dutch families in New York valued their traditions and celebrated their long history in the city. They spoke with pride about their ancestors and preserved customs that had been handed down for generations. Caroline grew up within this culture, and it gave her a sense of belonging that was rooted in shared heritage. As she moved into adulthood, Caroline was recognized as a figure of old money. Her family name immediately identified her position, and her upbringing had prepared her to carry it forward. She had learned how society worked, who had authority, and how authority was displayed through decisions about invitations, appearances, and relationships. She was not yet the central figure of New York society, but she already carried the tools that would allow her to play that role. By the time she reached her early 20s, she had absorbed all the lessons of her upbringing and was prepared to use them in the wider world of New York's elite. That wider world soon brought her face to face with a family whose wealth rivaled her heritage, and it came in the form of a marriage that would change her place in New York society. Marriage into new money. In 1853, Caroline Schermerhorn married William Backhouse Astor, Jr., connecting herself to one of the wealthiest families in America. The Astors had built their fortune through fur trading, real estate, and investments, and by the mid-19th century, their name carried weight in every corner of New York. Caroline came from a family that valued heritage and social standing, and marriage to William added money and property to her name. The union provided her with the foundation for a new role in the city's evolving world. William Astor Jr. lived quietly and avoided public attention. He had money, land, and the respect of his family name, but he did not take on leadership either in business or in society. His wealth, however, was immense. The Astors owned prime Manhattan property and were central to the city's growth. Through marriage, Caroline gained entry into this network. She was no longer only the daughter of the Schermerhorn family. She was now linked to the Astors, whose fortune shaped the future of New York. Caroline brought her own history into the marriage. The Schermerhorns had long been part of New York's older elite, with connections to the Dutch settlers who had helped establish the city. These families were respected for their heritage, even if they did not command as much money as the new millionaires. Caroline carried that background with her, and the Astors gained legitimacy through the tie. In return, she gained the financial strength of the Astor name. Together, heritage and money created a position few others could claim. The Astor household reflected this blend. Caroline entered a family where wealth was present in every detail of life. Homes were large, filled with staff, and tied to the family's expanding empire of real estate. As William's wife, Caroline lived in the middle of this fortune. William showed little interest in public competition or social maneuvering, which left her with room to manage the family's presence in New York. She began to understand that her place as his wife allowed her to shape the way people viewed the Astor fortune. The marriage shaped daily life as well. William preferred to spend time in country houses or traveling, while Caroline wanted to remain in New York, where she could oversee the family's role in the city. She often stayed in town when he did not. By doing so, she became the visible Astor to acquaintances, rivals, and the press. People began to associate the name with her presence, her choices, and her sense of order. She was the one who handled invitations, received visitors, and organized gatherings. The houses the couple occupied were symbols of their place in society. The Astor mansions stood as reminders of their wealth and control over New York's landscape. Caroline treated these homes as more than private spaces. She arranged them to show influence and to remind guests of the family's reach. The marriage gave her the resources to turn rooms and ballrooms into stages where prestige could be displayed. She oversaw these details carefully, showing how the Astor fortune could be translated into status. Caroline also learned the responsibilities that came with the Astor family. The public watched their movements closely. Newspapers reported on their travels and their homes. Social rivals paid attention to the guest lists of their dinners and receptions. Every action was measured against expectations. Caroline recognized that this required management. She worked to guard the family's reputation, to protect its image, and to maintain its rank in the city. By taking charge of this role, she placed herself at the center of the Astor household's public life. However, within the Astor clan, her position carried challenges. The family was large, with many branches, and wealth often led to competition. In-laws and cousins had their own interests in the fortune. Caroline learned how to navigate these relationships without losing focus. She concentrated on her own place in society and on presenting herself as the proper face of the Astor family. She joined her Schermerhorn ancestry to the Astor name and built a kind of authority that family members recognized. The period of the 1850s gave her even more opportunities. New York was growing quickly with immigration, business expansion, and construction. The Astors held property that determined the development of whole neighborhoods. Their fortune shaped the look of the city as streets were laid out and buildings went up. Caroline, by marriage, stood within this process. She saw how money determined direction, and she was positioned to benefit from it. This placed her in a world where influence was not only social, but also tied to the city's very growth. The private details of marriage also worked in her favor. William did not compete for recognition, so Caroline was free to carry the Astor name where it mattered. She signed the invitations, created the guest lists, and represented the family in society. She stepped into a role her husband avoided, and soon people connected the Astor presence in New York to her rather than to him. The family fortune gave her the shield of wealth, and she used it to act as the face of the dynasty in a way no one else did. This wealth gave her the stage, but it was her ambition that turned her into the undisputed Mrs. Astor. The rise of Mrs. Astor. New York in the mid-19th century was changing quickly. Old families who traced their roots back to Dutch and English settlers still valued heritage, and new fortunes sought their approval. Caroline belonged to both worlds. She carried the Schermerhorn name, which carried weight in New York history, and she gained the Astor wealth, which had become the largest fortune in the country. Together, these two forces placed her at the center of the city's social life. Caroline insisted on being known simply as Mrs. Astor. The name was shared by other women in the extended family, yet she declared herself the only one entitled to the unqualified title. The decision was deliberate. Newspapers began to use the term, and soon the wider public followed. The title gave her a clear identity, a single name that marked her as the leader of her household and as the recognized head of society. When people spoke of Mrs. Astor, they meant Caroline without question. Her authority showed in her presence. She carried herself with dignity and spoke with assurance. Her voice and manner gave weight to her words. She did not need to explain her influence because others accepted it in her company. In drawing rooms and at receptions, her approval or disapproval shaped reputations. An invitation from her confirmed status. The absence of one left a mark that people noticed. Social standing in New York often depended on how she received a family. Caroline built her reputation for exclusivity through her receptions and dinners. Guests received invitations only after her personal approval. Families who wanted to rise in society sought entry into her gatherings. People who attended spoke of the receptions as though they were attending a court. Presence in her company signaled recognition. Absence placed people outside the circle. Her entertainments became the most visible marker of acceptance into the city's select company. She also strengthened her influence by presenting herself as a guardian of family tradition. Families who valued their heritage trusted her to uphold standards. They looked to her as a leader who defended the customs that gave old names authority. She used this image to build alliances. Established families supported her position, and in return, she represented them in public life. She gave them a voice while also protecting her own leadership. Her private household followed the same order she demanded in society. She expected her daughters to marry with advantage, her sons to carry the family's dignity, and her servants to understand their duties with precision. Her public role as wife and mother was also shaped by the same discipline. Her husband, William Backhouse Astor Jr., preferred life away from social gatherings. He spent his time at his country estate and stayed out of her circles. His absence left her as the sole figure representing the family in New York. She accepted this position without hesitation. Guests and newspapers alike recognized that she embodied the Astor presence in society. By the 1870s, her leadership was secure. Rivals existed, yet none could displace her authority. Her name carried stability, her receptions signaled control, and her gatherings defined inclusion. Families seeking recognition looked to her for approval. Families who already held standing reinforced her position by supporting her leadership. She kept the city's social life in her hands and directed it according to her will. With her power undisputed, she moved to draw a sharper line, deciding exactly who belonged within New York society and who would remain outside of it. The famous 400. Caroline Astor had started to be known for one idea above everything else, the 400. This was the name given to her carefully chosen list of people who counted as New York's true high society. The list carried enormous weight. Families measured their importance by whether they were included. An invitation from Mrs. Astor confirmed that someone had reached the very top of social life in the city. The number was not random. Caroline fixed 400 as the proper size of society. It gave her a clear boundary to enforce and a way to decide who belonged and who did not. The figure carried authority because it suggested a natural limit to exclusivity. Anyone accepted within the circle was recognized. Anyone excluded remained on the outside. People in New York began to treat the 400 as if it were official. Newspapers reported on it. Columnists wrote about who was included and who was not. Families who secured a place on the list displayed it as a badge of honor. Their names appeared in print beside other powerful families. Readers across the country learned to associate the 400 with elegance, wealth, and social acceptance. For Caroline, the list became a way to control who counted in her world. She had the final say over names. Families who wanted to rise in society had to wait for her recognition. She could grant it with inclusion or deny it through omission. In both cases, she decided who could claim a place among New York's elite. Life in the city during the late 19th century made the 400 especially important. New fortunes were being created through railroads, steel, and banking. Families who had never been noticed before suddenly wore diamonds, filled their tables with imported delicacies, and demanded recognition. The 400 was the only proof that this recognition had been granted. Exclusion from the list was as powerful as inclusion. Families who were left off could not attend the most important events of the season. Their daughters were not introduced to the right circles. Their names were absent from the social pages that everyone read. They could buy houses and jewels, but they could not purchase the place that only Mrs. Astor could bestow. This gave her enormous influence over people who were wealthy, yet still eager for acceptance. The 400 also created order in a city where fortunes were constantly rising and falling. By fixing a number, Caroline drew a firm boundary around high society. The group remained selective, even while new wealth poured into New York. The boundary slowed the pace at which newcomers could enter. Families had to prove themselves through behavior, connections, and persistence before they earned recognition. The number gave her the tool to regulate this flow. The effect reached far beyond New York. In other cities, local elites noticed the power of the 400 and copied the idea. Lists appeared in Boston, Philadelphia, and Chicago. They carried less weight than Mrs. Astor's, but they showed how her method shaped the way Americans thought about class and social standing. Society began to appear organized, not scattered. It looked fixed, even though names on the list shifted with deaths, marriages, and new generations. Caroline's control over the 400 gave her unmatched authority. She could elevate a family by including their name. She could silence them by refusing it. Many of the richest people in New York accepted her authority because they understood the cost of exclusion. The balance of power was tilted in her favor. She did not need to command armies or pass laws. She only needed to decide whose name deserved recognition. The list also established a standard for what society meant in America. Other countries had nobility and titles. The United States had no such system. The 400 filled that gap by presenting an American version of aristocracy. It gave names and numbers to the families who represented the highest level of life in New York. This image spread through magazines and newspapers until it became part of the national imagination. The 400 was never completely stable. Names shifted over time. Families moved out, new ones came in, and events changed reputations. But the principle stayed the same. 400 names defined New York society. They set the standard of fashion, behavior, and influence for the entire city. The list was both a tool of control and a statement of identity. Yet not everyone accepted her control quietly, especially the rising Vanderbilt clan. Rivalries and social battles. By the early 1880s, her influence was tested by a new set of families who had become wealthy from railroads, industry, and business. Among them were the Vanderbilts, who had accumulated enormous wealth and began seeking recognition in the very world Caroline controlled. The Vanderbilts were led socially by Alva Vanderbilt, the wife of William K. Vanderbilt. Alva was determined to establish her family among the recognized elite. She believed her wealth, connections, and energy were enough to gain the acceptance that had been withheld from her. For Caroline, the Vanderbilts represented something she opposed. She valued lineage and heritage above all else. While the Vanderbilts had only recently risen in wealth, she had no intention of extending an open hand to them. Caroline made her feelings clear by refusing to visit the Vanderbilts or acknowledge them publicly. In the world of society, a simple call of respect or a personal visit carried enormous weight. Her refusal marked the Vanderbilts as outsiders. She reinforced this further by leaving their names off her guest lists and by discouraging her circle from extending courtesies to them. This made it difficult for the Vanderbilts to gain entry into established gatherings, no matter how much money they spent on luxuries. Alva Vanderbilt responded by creating her own opportunity. In 1883, she planned a large costume ball designed to outshine anything New York had seen before. The scale of this event was extraordinary. She spared no expense, bringing in designers, decorators, and suppliers to stage one of the most impressive displays of the era. Guests were expected to wear elaborate costumes, and preparations for the ball filled the city's newspapers with speculation. The cost ran into hundreds of thousands of dollars, which made it one of the most expensive private events in the country at that time. The ball quickly became the most anticipated gathering of the year. Families who had long considered themselves the backbone of society wanted to attend. Daughters from established households hoped to appear at the event, as it promised attention and opportunity. Husbands and wives felt pressure to secure a place, fearing exclusion would mark them as unimportant. Caroline recognized the interest building around Alva's plans, but she also knew that attending would mean a public acknowledgement of the Vanderbilts. Her decision grew complicated when her daughter, Carrie Astor, asked to go. Carrie wanted to be part of what her peers were talking about, and not being invited would place her at the edges of social life. The Vanderbilts had not extended an invitation to Carrie, and they would not do so unless Caroline herself recognized them first. This placed Caroline in a difficult position, as she understood the consequences of keeping her daughter away from such an important event. Caroline considered her options carefully. She had spent years setting rules about who was acceptable in society, and she had worked hard to hold the Vanderbilts back. Yet the scale of Alva's ball, combined with her daughter's request, left her with little room to maneuver. To secure Carrie's place at the gathering, she needed to make a social call to Alva Vanderbilt. That gesture alone would signal acceptance. Caroline eventually made the visit. Alva received her politely, and the simple act of Caroline Astor crossing that line carried weight across New York. Shortly afterward, Carrie received her invitation, and both she and Caroline attended the ball. This moment marked the first time the Astors publicly acknowledged the Vanderbilts as part of society. The Vanderbilt Ball of 1883 became a turning point in the social life of New York. Reports of the event filled newspapers, and descriptions of costumes and decorations fascinated readers. More than the spectacle, though, it became known as the occasion when the Vanderbilts crossed the line from outsiders to accepted members of society. Caroline's recognition gave them the validation they had been seeking. The rivalry between Caroline Astor and Alva Vanderbilt came to symbolize a broader change. Old families had long assumed that their background and traditions guaranteed their place at the top. New fortunes like the Vanderbilts showed that money, when combined with determination and display, could secure the same position. Society began to include families who had recently risen in wealth, even when their names carried no history. Caroline remained an influential figure, but she now shared space with people she had once excluded. The Vanderbilts had forced their way in, and others soon followed. The shape of New York society began to widen, with both long-established names and rising fortunes present at the same gatherings. Caroline's attempt to guard the gates of society had reached its limit, and her authority was no longer absolute. And as the Vanderbilts secured their place, the focus shifted back to Caroline's own gatherings, where she worked harder than ever to enforce her dominance. Her Fifth Avenue mansion now stood not just as her home, but as her fortress and throne. The Fifth Avenue Mansion. At 350 Fifth Avenue, she lived in a mansion that carried weight in the city. The address itself mattered, planted in a part of Manhattan that was becoming the stage for America's wealthiest families. The house acted as a symbol of power, with its staircases, rooms, and grand exterior serving as a visible reminder of the Astor name. The mansion had been designed to impress. Built in the French Renaissance style, it projected dignity and stability that matched Caroline's vision for her place in society. Fifth Avenue was lined with the homes of wealthy families, yet hers stood out for its size and authority. Passers-by could see from its stone exterior and large windows that this was a house built to last. The mansion announced the Astor name with every detail, sending a message that the family intended to stay at the top of New York's hierarchy. Inside, the rooms reinforced the same message. High ceilings, carved wood, and imported materials created an atmosphere of grandeur. Paintings, chandeliers, and gilded mirrors filled the walls and halls. Each furnishing was carefully chosen to signal refinement. Caroline directed how the mansion should look and made sure it reflected the values of order and elegance. Entering the mansion felt like stepping into the seat of authority, not just a private residence. The location added to its significance. Fifth Avenue was being transformed into the corridor of the elite, with families moving north to build larger homes. By placing herself at 355th Avenue, Caroline established her position among the city's leading families. The house gave her both prominence and visibility, and it set the tone for what others would follow. Anyone seeking social recognition understood that Fifth Avenue was the place to be, and Caroline was firmly at its center. For Caroline, the mansion acted as a stronghold. Its walls guarded her from those she did not wish to admit, while creating a space for the people she chose to welcome. The building allowed her to shape her image and project influence. In a city of shifting fortunes, the Astor residence gave the impression of security and permanence. Families who looked at it saw a dynasty that did not appear fragile or temporary. The ballroom stood at the heart of the house. It had enough space to hold hundreds of guests. This room also became tied to her well-known 400 list. The number she claimed reflected the capacity of her ballroom and the limit of true New York society. The ballroom's design was meant to impress, but its greater purpose lay in the power of inclusion and exclusion. Those admitted into the room had proof of their standing, while those left out knew they had no place within her circle. The mansion served as a stage where identities were shaped. Its chandeliers, sweeping staircases, and grand halls carried weight that extended beyond decoration. Being inside meant recognition, and the house itself created a boundary between those who belonged and those who did not. Observers outside could only guess at the alliances, introductions, and decisions that took place within its walls. The mansion also shaped ideas of wealth in New York. At a time when many families were gaining fortunes through business or industry, Caroline's house gave the impression of stability and control. It stood for a kind of wealth that appeared settled and enduring. Families who hoped to enter her circle often measured themselves against what 355th Avenue represented. The home became the standard for what counted as established success. The house was also a reflection of her family. William Backhouse Astor Jr., her husband, provided the money to build and maintain it. He lived a quieter life and did not seek the same public role as Caroline, but the mansion carried his name. Caroline directed how it functioned, shaping it into more than a residence. She turned it into a tool of influence. In doing so, she attached the Astor family identity to the house and reinforced its place in the city. For New Yorkers, the mansion became a landmark. Newspapers described it, visitors spoke of it, and rivals observed it. Among the wealthy, it became a marker of social order. Its presence on Fifth Avenue reminded everyone that Caroline Astor's approval was central to high society. Even as the city grew, the mansion kept its reputation as one of the defining symbols of the Gilded Age. And soon, from within the walls of this mansion, Caroline dazzled New York with parties that became legend. Extravagant entertaining. During the Gilded Age, parties were more than social gatherings. They were the stage where wealth, style, and position were displayed. For her, entertaining was the clearest way to show authority in New York society. Her Fifth Avenue mansion served as the main setting. The ballroom inside was built to impress and could hold hundreds of people. Large chandeliers lit the room. Paintings and decorative details filled the walls. Servants in uniform moved with precision. Every feature of the house was arranged to present an image of order and grandeur. Guests entering the space understood immediately that they were in the most important house in the city. The evenings themselves were demonstrations of wealth and refinement. Women wore gowns imported from Paris, often prepared months in advance. Men wore formal black coats, polished shoes, and carefully tied cravats. Jewelry glistened under the light. Pearls, diamonds, and emeralds were displayed openly. Each guest knew they were being observed. Presentation was part of the event, and appearance was judged silently throughout the evening. Dining was organized with the same level of control. Meals were long and elaborate, sometimes extending to more than a dozen courses. Imported wines were chosen to match each dish. Silver cutlery and porcelain sets were laid out on polished tables. Every plate was served with care. Guests did not see food as nourishment, but as a performance. The dining table demonstrated wealth as effectively as the ballroom. Music was constant during these gatherings. Large orchestras played waltzes, marches, and operatic pieces. Musicians provided an unbroken background that filled the ballroom with rhythm. Dancing was central to the evening. Partners were chosen with attention to family, reputation, and position. Stepping onto the dance floor was a form of display. A woman paired with a respected man signaled her own standing. Movement on the floor became a language of hierarchy. Conversations were just as important as dancing. Guests filled parlors and drawing rooms to speak about travel, literature, art, and politics. Tone and manner mattered as much as the subject. Mrs. Astor observed interactions carefully. She noted who spoke well, who carried themselves with grace, and who failed to meet expectations. Impressions formed during these hours could shape a person's standing for the rest of the season. The timing of events followed the social calendar. Her largest gatherings took place in winter when New York's wealthiest families returned from their summer estates. The season revolved around balls, receptions, and dinners, and her invitations marked the most important dates. Attendance at her events became a priority. Declining or missing them without reason created whispers. Families planned their movements around her schedule. The rhythm of her entertainment set the rhythm of society itself. These evenings confirmed Mrs. Astor's position. Every event reminded guests who held power over their inclusion. Parties were not random entertainments. They were instruments of authority. Attending one of her balls meant recognition. To be absent meant silence. The gatherings kept her at the center of attention without the need for words or open declarations. The size and expense of her parties added to their weight. While many families in New York held dinners or receptions, her events were larger, brighter, and more elaborate. The scale of her entertainment set her apart. The sheer number of guests, the quality of the decor, and the cost of the food made her gatherings the peak of the season. Even those with immense fortunes measured themselves against the standards she set. Reports of her entertainment spread through newspapers and social pages. Journalists described the gowns, the food, and the music. They wrote about the number of carriages outside and the people who attended. Though the public could not see the guest list itself, the descriptions in print amplified her reputation. Readers across the country learned that Mrs. Astor's parties defined the highest level of New York life. But behind the glitter, every guest list was a weapon in her careful game of social control. Schemes and social control. Caroline Astor understood that wealth alone could not guarantee lasting influence in New York high society. Fortunes rose and fell quickly during the Gilded Age, but status depended on something less tangible: control. She built a system that allowed her to guide relationships, direct outcomes, and keep herself at the center of power. One of her strongest tools was the arrangement of marriages. To her, a match was not just about two individuals, but about the alignment of names, fortunes, and reputations. A daughter from a respected lineage might bring refinement and heritage, while the groom's side could add fresh capital or political ties. These unions were less about affection and more about strategy. Caroline often signaled her approval by supporting a match publicly, inviting the pair to her gatherings, or offering a subtle endorsement that carried great weight. Families who secured her recognition saw their unions elevated, while those who acted without her blessing risked weakening their social standing, no matter how large their fortunes. Marriage, however, was only one piece of her broader strategy. Caroline cultivated a network that spanned the industrial, political, and cultural worlds of New York. She understood that society did not exist in isolation but intersected with business and politics at every turn. By maintaining close relationships with financiers, railroad barons, and political leaders, she ensured that her circle remained relevant to the real engines of power. Her table was not just a place for polite dining. It was where connections were tested, bonds were built, and decisions were quietly influenced. She gave particular attention to women of established families, many of whom carried influence equal to their husbands. These women became allies, conduits of information, and stabilizers of Caroline's authority. Together, they reinforced the values of lineage, refinement, and cultural stewardship that distinguished their circle from the newly rich. Yet Caroline was smart enough to acknowledge industrial fortunes when they could not be ignored. By drawing certain families closer, carefully, cautiously, she ensured that her own position adapted to the shifting tides without being swept aside. Her control worked because she managed balance with remarkable patience. She distributed her attention accordingly, keeping families tied to her without allowing them to become independent centers of power. A well-timed gesture, a word of recognition, or a simple presence at an event could reassure allies while reminding them that their strength was tied to her. This ability to measure out influence in calculated amounts preserved her authority even as New York society expanded in wealth and ambition. Her methods resembled those of a planner working several steps ahead. When she observed a promising young man from a respected family, she might orchestrate introductions that positioned him for a future alliance. When she saw a wealthy newcomer eager for recognition, she could test him in smaller settings, at a dinner table, before granting broader approval. She operated with patience, observing and adjusting, never rushing decisions that would shape reputations for years to come. Caroline also extended her authority beyond her home. The opera, for instance, became one of her most visible stages. Her box was not just a place to watch performances, it was a throne from which she displayed influence. Those seated with her were recognized as secure, while others watched closely for any sign of favor or neglect. Dinner parties, carriage rides, and cultural outings all carried similar weight. Beneath the surface of polite conversation, business arrangements, political understandings, and social alliances were being formed, with Caroline presiding as the silent orchestrator. Her influence reached into civic life as well. A charity with her name attached carried credibility that others could not match. Cultural institutions she supported, whether museums, clubs, or educational projects, gained immediate attention. Families often aligned their activities with hers, shaping their philanthropy and cultural interests to reflect her own. By doing so, they secured her acknowledgement and showed that they understood the unspoken rules of her world. In this way, her approval became a form of currency that extended far beyond a single ballroom. The pressure of her system fell heaviest on those seeking entry. Families eager to rise in society spent lavishly on gowns, carriages, and mansions, but material display alone was never enough. They studied Caroline's behavior for signs, copying her tastes, aligning themselves with her causes, and waiting for gestures of recognition. Even without words, her subtle nods, her associations, and her choices of company guided their actions. The mere possibility of approval or neglect shaped how families moved, invested, and presented themselves. Over time, these methods created a hierarchy with Caroline at its center. She influenced who connected with whom, which families advanced, and which remained in the background. Alliances bore her mark, reputations carried the weight of her judgment, and the structure of New York high society reflected her design. She had built more than a circle of friends. She had created a system of control that touched every aspect of society, binding wealth, politics, and culture to her authority. Such power, however, came with whispers, scandals, and more than a few enemies. Scandals and criticism. Caroline Astor was often at the center of whispers about her behavior and influence. She had the ability to decide who was accepted into New York's elite circles, and that position drew strong criticism. Many described her as arrogant, saying she carried herself as if her decisions were final. People noticed that she rarely explained herself, and those excluded from her gatherings often fueled talk about her being too controlling. Over time, her reputation became divided between admiration for her authority and disapproval of her methods. Exclusivity was the issue most people raised against her. The 400 list became famous, and the number itself came from how many people her ballroom could hold. Families that believed they deserved inclusion, but were left out, felt insulted. The rejection carried weight in a society that valued recognition more than wealth alone. Each time a name was missing, it created tension. The city's ambitious families turned their disappointment into gossip, and stories spread quickly about who had been left off and why. These rumors deepened the idea that Caroline cared more about keeping people out than bringing them in. Invitations were more than pieces of paper. They were symbols of approval, and Caroline used them carefully. Those who angered her sometimes found themselves without an invitation to the next ball. A single omission could cause humiliation in a society where appearances mattered. This pattern gave critics the impression that she was manipulative. They believed she used social gatherings as tools to reward loyalty and punish disobedience. The guest list was her form of power, and she managed it with precision. For people watching from the outside, it appeared calculated and deliberate. Her rivals highlighted this side of her whenever they could. Alva Vanderbilt became one of her most public challengers. Alva's efforts to enter society included extravagant parties and public displays of wealth. Yet Caroline resisted recognizing her for years. Newspapers quickly seized on the story, portraying it as a clash between two powerful women. Caroline's unwillingness to accept the Vanderbilts was interpreted as a refusal to acknowledge new fortunes. Those who sided with Alva saw Caroline as a barrier to progress, while others defended her as a guardian of tradition. The conflict gave the press material for endless columns and ensured that Caroline's exclusivity remained a public issue. Journalists also painted her as a figure who ruled society with firmness. Reports accused her of favoring some families while dismissing others without reason, which was true for most parts. The way she hosted gatherings was compared to political maneuvering, with each invitation serving as an endorsement. To be seen in her ballroom meant acknowledgement by the upper tier of New York. To be excluded meant embarrassment. These public divisions created resentment among families who believed they had earned their place. Her control over recognition fueled the idea that she dictated society according to her own preferences. Beyond rivals and rejected families, criticism also came from the general public. At the time, the gap between wealthy elites and struggling citizens was highly visible. Caroline's balls were described in newspapers with details of expensive decorations, gowns, and menus. Ordinary readers, many living in cramped housing or working long hours for little pay, found such stories difficult to accept. To them, Caroline became a symbol of privilege and detachment. The extravagance of her lifestyle, combined with the exclusivity of her social circle, made her an easy target for those who resented the growing inequalities of the Gilded Age. Even within her circle, frustrations grew. Many guests smiled and played their part at her gatherings, but in private, they voiced their complaints. Being close to Caroline came with benefits, but it also carried risks. People feared falling out of favor and losing the recognition that came with her approval. This created an atmosphere of caution. Families tried to please her, while at the same time building alliances that might protect them if they were ever excluded. Rival hostesses attempted to outshine her by hosting their own gatherings, but her name remained the one that mattered most. Dependence on her approval created a cycle that fed both loyalty and resentment. People who benefited from her invitations often defended her in public, but in private, some admitted they felt controlled. Others tried to find ways to enter society through different channels, but her grip on the highest level remained strong. These tensions created endless gossip in drawing rooms across New York. Every decision she made about who to include or exclude became fuel for speculation. The conversations about her behavior became part of the city's culture. Caroline's position as leader of society meant that criticism never left her side. She was accused of arrogance, exclusivity, and manipulation, and her name became tied to those traits in both private and public discussions. She rarely gave direct responses to her critics. Instead, she continued hosting events and shaping the guest lists according to her own judgment. By doing so, she reinforced the idea that she was unmoved by outside opinion. This silence only added to the impression that she believed her authority did not need justification. Caroline Astor's life was more than just parties, rivalries, and scandals. It was the shaping of an entire social order. She turned her home into a court, her guest lists into instruments of power, and her presence into a mark of legitimacy. Yet as the Gilded Age rolled forward, even she could not hold back the surge of new wealth and shifting values. Her legacy remains as both a symbol of elegance and a reminder of how fragile power can be when society itself begins to change. And that's the story of the woman who defined New York's high society. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, subscribe, and let me know in the comments which figure you'd like me to cover next.